shut down dangerous ideas or perhaps unpalatable opinions, let alone something as mild as an opinion that may not be politically correct, actually protect anybody. So I go back to, what does the P then stand for? And we keep getting told this is all about protecting people, stopping all these crazy wasps, as Drew made reference to earlier, running around beheading people in the street, punching people, violence. Yet none of that's ever really occurred here. So what is it all about? And again I say the P is for power. It is political correctness. Political means politics, and politics is a game of power. Unfortunately, the elected politicians seem quite stupid, weak, cowardly, maybe just thick. And they don't seem to see the great darkness that is looming in Western societies like Australia. And I'm a supporter of Tony Abbott. As far as I can see, the alternative is not there. So, out of Mr. Shortend and Mr. Abbott, I know where I'd park my money on at coin toss. But when Mr. Abbott the other day came out and said that his decision not to proceed with the promise to repeal 18C was a quote-unquote leadership call, I was very disappointed, as I'm certainly not alone. A leadership call in this manner is code for something quite dark. And that is that in the Liberal Party now as well, it seems that multiculturalism, no matter what people think about it, overrides freedom of speech in a liberal democratic society. And that is something that I'm fairly sure the founding fathers of, say, the American nation, the Canadian nation, Britain or Australia, could never ever have fathomed. That a non-voted upon, non-referendum question, a concept like multiculturalism can somehow trump or triumph over what I think everyone should consider a central tenet of liberal democracies, and that is freedom of speech. And to have that come from a so-called conservative Prime Minister, you'd expect it perhaps from the other side, but that is, to me anyway, great concern. Christopher Pyne, though, not to be outdone, he loves the cameras, came out and said that the government should be congratulated, in his words, for listening. Listening to who? Listening to 4,000 or 5,000 submissions, no doubt, whipped around the quick email from the lobby groups, as opposed to listening to the millions, and I repeat, millions of people that voted for him and his party only 11 months ago, when this was one of the central issues of the campaign. If Mr. Pyne's definition of being a good politician and listening to people is anything to go by, I guess tomorrow he's going to announce that he's scrapping his plans to deregulate universities, because of course there's been tens of thousands of people protesting about that. Perhaps Mr. Pyne has selective tinnitus on issues. But this is all about power, and I think we have to also try to understand briefly the context of how this all comes about. None of these things just happen by chance. In a society that is virulently in defence of its freedoms and of what people would, I think, consider their constitutional rights, you would expect a pretty big fight back against all of this gradual tsunami of political correctness that is chipping away slowly and slowly at our way of life. And it's doing it in a very clever way. Because often, if you go back 30, 40 years, the politically correct stuff was all getting underway. Through racial groups, feminist groups, all of the sort of what you would, I guess, consider fringe groups at the time. And the opinions that those people, the proponents of all of this, the first wave of the PC Brigade expressed, really, I guess you could say, ran contrary to the law of the land in many respects. However, the laws, as we've seen over the last 40 years, are rapidly catching up to the politically correct mantra and its ideology, so that really the two are now not in conflict anymore, but are becoming equally symbiotic. Think about race laws, gay marriage laws, gender laws, for example, the great push at the moment to have women fighting on the front line, Indigenous issues, and of course what we're here to talk about now, freedom of speech. Once upon a time, it would have been anathema to think that you couldn't express a reasonable opinion that might offend somebody. I mean, you know, anybody can be offended about anything. So what's the big deal? But these days, if it's on race, it's verboten. The law has caught up with the politically correct mantra to the point where the two protect each other instead of potentially fight against each other. And the losers, I guess, are the average Australians, reasonable, well-thinking, well-intentioned individuals that want to have an opinion. Now, often I've found that I'm in an awkward predicament on air because somebody's expressing something that I may not agree with or I might agree with, but it cuts a little close to the mustard for ACMA. And ACMA is in part and fairly one of those unelected kind of bodies that is put together by politicians and academics or whatever, and they determine what we can and can't say. Now, again, the listener, the caller, may not be expressing hatred, they may not be expressing a call to arms. If they were doing that, I'd kill the call. Don't want any of that. But it might be deemed a little difficult for the ears of the sensitive. And I think in all of this, we've got to take an element of offence to what's going on, because the authorities are deeming us to be muppets. That's what it comes down to, idiots. You couldn't possibly determine what the nuance of what they're saying. You hear some wacko say, let's go and bomb X, or let's go and invade Y, and where's the pitchfork? That's the mindset. They don't give us the ability of rational thought. Well, that's the argument they make anyway. And of course it was only going to get worse with the Finkelstein inquiry and the convergence review of the previous government. Thankfully that at least was knocked on the head. But the context about where all this comes from, I think we have to look at education. Because increasingly it's my belief that through the schools, through the universities, as Drew pointed out, we are indoctrinating rather than educating, to a certain extent, generations of people to believe the myths that are perpetuated by the PC warriors. And simultaneous to that, critical thought has gone out the window, particularly in academia, up in the university sector, where consensus is much preferred over challenge, and a brave person, not just in the circumstances that Drew outlined, but even in an academic sort of point of view, a brave person challenges the consensus. So if we're breeding generations of youth that then grow up to accept all of this as normal, not to think critically, not to challenge, the next wave, of course, makes its way through pop culture. It's only then further enforced. And the case of, I think, Margaret Court, that Rocco pointed out, is an exact case of that. Of course, the Twitterati go into overdrive. Margaret's booed out of the tennis centre that she once held, literally, excuse the pun, court over when she was at the top of the game, or because she expresses an opinion that runs contrary to what the little darlings think is a fact. And then, of course, to finish the big whammy, in comes the law, just to make sure that anybody who can eloquently put together a counter opinion to the unelected consensus is shut down. It's all about power. It is about the power to shut down the debate when it gets a little hot in the kitchen for those who are part of the politically correct group. That's all it's about. When they are being defeated on the rostra with ideas and rhetoric, they scream offence. They scream political correctness, discrimination, whatever these words we hear, racism, homophobia, sex. There's an ism for everything that isn't what they like, and it's the equivalent of the boxing coach throwing in the towel. It ends the fight, but the stronger boxer doesn't get his arm raised at the end of the bout. The weak one gets the victory, because the knockout blow is not allowed. And this is the problem with where we're at now. Political correctness, in my view, doesn't just compromise freedom of speech, it runs counter to it. It is an anathema to freedom of speech, and it is about power. It is about power from unelected individuals, and the sooner society and potentially, certainly the political class wake up to it, I think the better for all of us. Thank you for having me here this evening.